The manila envelope trembled in Roberto Martinez's weathered hands like a leaf caught in an autumn wind as he sat in the sterile waiting room of St. Mary's Hospital. At 63 years old, with salt and pepper hair that Elena lovingly trimmed every month, and hands that bore the honest scars of 4 decades in construction, he thought he knew everything there was to know about himself. He knew his father's stubborn streak that had driven him to work double shifts at the steel mill, even when his back screamed in protest. He knew his mother's gentle eyes that could convey love without words and disapproval without anger. He knew the way his grandfather's gnarled hands had guided his own small fingers as they learned to work with wood, teaching him that patience and precision were the foundations of any craft worth mastering. But the blood test results tucked inside that innocent-looking envelope were about to shatter 6 decades of certainty like glass against stone, revealing a truth so profound and earth-shaking that it would send him on a journey he never imagined taking, a quest that would challenge everything he believed about family, identity, and the very nature of belonging itself. Welcome back to our channel, where we share stories that remind us that life's most extraordinary chapters often begin when we least expect them, when the ground beneath our feet shifts and reveals paths we never knew existed. If these tales of resilience, discovery, and the unbreakable human spirit move you the way they move me, consider subscribing. We have so many more incredible journeys of hope and transformation to share together. Stories that prove it's never too late to discover who you really are. Roberto Martinez had always been a man of unwavering routine, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of a life well ordered and carefully maintained. Every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years, without fail, he had driven his aging but reliable Honda Civic, the same car he'd bought when he retired from Martinez Construction, the small company he'd built from nothing but determination and calloused hands, to St. Mary's Hospital for his routine cardiac checkup. This ritual had become a necessity after his mild heart attack 3 years prior had given both him and his beloved wife Elena a scare that still echoed in their quiet moments together, a reminder that time was more precious and fragile than they'd allowed themselves to believe during their younger, more invincible years. Dr. Patricia Williams, his cardiologist, had been consistently optimistic during these visits, her professional demeanor softened by genuine care as she explained that with proper monitoring, the right medications, and the kind of healthy lifestyle changes that retirement had finally made possible, Roberto could reasonably expect many more years of the peaceful golden years he'd worked so hard to earn. His heart, she assured him, was responding well to treatment. His blood pressure was manageable. His cholesterol levels, while not perfect, were within acceptable ranges for a man his age who had spent decades consuming Elena's rich, traditional cooking without complaint. But that particular Tuesday in late October felt different from the moment Roberto opened his eyes in the pre-dawn darkness of their bedroom. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, like the way the air feels just before a storm, charged with an electricity that makes the hair on your arms stand on end, even when you can't yet see the clouds gathering on the horizon. Elena had commented on it over their morning coffee, noting with the intuitive awareness that comes from nearly 4 decades of marriage, how he'd stared longer than usual at the framed family photograph on their kitchen table, the treasured image where his parents, both long deceased but still vivid in his memory, smiled beside him at his wedding 38 years ago. Miguel Martinez had been a mountain of a man in that photograph, his broad shoulders filling out his only good suit, his dark eyes reflecting the quiet pride of a father watching his son take the next step toward building his own family. Carmen Martinez had looked radiant despite her simple dress and carefully styled hair, her gentle smile conveying all the love and hope she carried for her son's future happiness. Between them stood Roberto, young and nervous and blissfully unaware that this moment of perfect family unity would someday be called into question by something as simple and devastating as a blood test. "You look just like your father when you make that face," Elena had said that morning, reaching across their small kitchen table to straighten his collar with the same tender gesture she'd used for decades, her fingers gentle against his neck as she performed this small act of wifely devotion that had become as natural as breathing. Roberto had nodded absent-mindedly, accepting her observation as he had countless times before, But something about her words that morning felt different, hollow, like an echo reverberating in an empty room he couldn't quite identify or locate within the familiar landscape of his consciousness. Dr. Patricia Williams had been practicing cardiology for over 30 years, long enough to develop the clinical precision that comes from delivering both good news and bad news to thousands of patients. But she had never quite mastered the delicate art of softening life's harder edges when they presented themselves in her examination room. She was a competent physician, respected by her colleagues and trusted by her patients, but bedside manner had always been something she had to work at, rather than something that came naturally to her scientific mind. That Tuesday morning, she had delivered the initial news with her characteristic directness and professional efficiency. Roberto's heart was strong, she explained while consulting her tablet and reviewing the latest test results, stronger than expected for a man his age who had survived a cardiac event and was managing the ongoing challenges of heart disease. His EKG showed steady rhythms, his stress test results were encouraging, and his overall cardiovascular health appeared to be stable and well managed through medication and lifestyle modifications. But then Dr. Williams had paused in her delivery, her brow furrowing as she scrolled through additional data on her tablet, her expression shifting from routine satisfaction to something that looked distinctly like puzzlement. The silence stretched between them for several seconds, broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of hospital activity filtering through the closed door of the examination room. "There's something unusual here, Roberto," she had finally continued, her voice taking on that particular tone medical professionals unconsciously adopted when venturing into uncertain territory, when the familiar scripts of routine medical consultations gave way to conversations that required more careful navigation. "Your blood work shows that you're type O negative, which is interesting in itself since it's a relatively rare blood type. But according to your family medical history that we have on file, both your parents were listed as type A positive." Roberto had blinked several times, processing her words but not immediately grasping their significance, his mind still operating under the assumption that this was simply another routine piece of medical information, another data point in the complex equation of his health that Dr. Williams would explain and contextualize in terms he could understand. "Is that bad for my heart condition?" he had asked, his voice carrying the slight uncertainty that most patients feel when their doctors mention something unexpected, when the familiar rhythm of a routine appointment suddenly takes an unfamiliar turn. "Doctor!" Williams had set down her tablet with deliberate care and leaned forward slightly in her chair, her expression growing more serious as she prepared to deliver information that would fundamentally alter her patient's understanding of himself and his place in the world. "From a cardiac standpoint, your blood type has no bearing on your condition," she explained carefully. "But from a genetic standpoint, Roberto, what I'm seeing here is quite significant. You see, it's genetically impossible for two A-positive parents to produce an O-negative child. The blood type inheritance patterns simply don't allow for that combination. Two A-positive parents can have children who are type A or type O, but those O children would be O-positive, not O-negative." The words seemed to hang in the sterile air of the examination room like smoke from an extinguished candle, visible and substantial but impossible to grasp, carrying implications that Roberto's mind was not yet ready to fully comprehend or accept. Roberto had sat there in the paper examination gown that made him feel vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical exposure, trying to process what he was hearing, while his newly healthy heart began to beat with an irregular rhythm that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition and everything to do with the ground shifting beneath his feet. The examination room, with its familiar medical equipment and motivational posters about heart health, suddenly felt like foreign territory, as if he had somehow been transported to a parallel universe where the fundamental laws of his existence no longer applied. The blood pressure cuff that had been removed from his arm still left indentations in his skin, but those temporary marks seemed insignificant compared to the permanent impression that Dr. Williams' words were carving into his consciousness. "There must be some mistake," he had finally managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking through him while his real self remained frozen in disbelief. "Maybe the laboratory mixed up my blood sample with someone else's?" These things happen, right? Medical errors, administrative mistakes. But, Doctor, Williams had shaken her head with a kind of gentle certainty that comes from double-checking impossible things. From running tests twice and consulting with colleagues and reviewing procedures to eliminate any possibility of error. We ran the blood work twice, Roberto, using 2 separate samples drawn on different days. Both tests showed identical results. Your blood type is definitively O negative, and the genetic science behind blood type inheritance is very well established and completely reliable. There's no ambiguity or room for interpretation in these results. She had paused then, her clinical training warring with her human instinct to soften the blow of life-changing revelations. Roberto, I need to ask you directly. Have you ever considered the possibility that you might have been adopted? Or that your family situation might be more complex than what's reflected in your official medical records? The question had landed like a physical blow, knocking the breath from Roberto's lungs and leaving him struggling to find words that could adequately respond to such a fundamental challenge to everything he had believed about himself. Adoption? The word felt foreign and impossible, like a term from someone else's life, someone else's story, someone else's complicated family dynamics. The drive home from the hospital that afternoon passed in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly seemed to belong to a different world, as if Roberto was navigating through a neighborhood he had never seen before, despite having lived there for over 20 years. Every landmark, the corner grocery store where he bought his morning newspaper, the gas station where he filled his Honda every Thursday, the park where he and Elena had taken their evening walks for years, looked the same but felt fundamentally altered, viewed through the lens of questions that had never existed before that morning. His hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, his knuckles white against the worn leather that had been shaped by years of his touch, as if the familiar sensation of driving could anchor him to some sense of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become unmoored from everything he thought he knew about himself and his place within it. The house he shared with Elena, a modest ranch-style home with the blue shutters she had insisted on when they first moved in, the carefully tended garden that had become her passion in retirement, and the workshop he had built in the backyard where he spent hours crafting furniture and repairing things that other people would have simply replaced, looked smaller somehow when he pulled into their driveway, as if the entire world had shifted on its axis while he wasn't paying attention, leaving familiar things in unfamiliar proportions. Elena was exactly where he had expected to find her, kneeling in her beloved rose garden, wearing the wide-brimmed hat that protected her fair skin from the afternoon sun, and the gardening gloves that had become as much a part of her daily uniform as the reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She was tending to the late-season blooms with the same methodical care she brought to everything in their life together, deadheading spent flowers and checking for signs of disease or pest damage with the attention to detail that had made their garden the envy of their neighbors. She looked up at the sound of his car engine, her face immediately creasing with the kind of concern that comes from knowing someone so well that you can read their emotional state in the set of their shoulders or the way they close a car door. After 38 years of marriage, Elena could interpret Roberto's moods and mental state with an accuracy that sometimes surprised even him. "What did Dr. Williams say?" she asked, as she pulled off her gardening gloves and approached him, her voice carrying that particular mixture of hope and worry that had become familiar during the years since his heart attack, when every medical appointment carried the potential for either reassurance or devastating news. "Is everything okay with your heart? Are the medications working the way they should?" Roberto stood beside his car, still holding the envelope containing his test results, feeling like a man who had discovered that gravity might not be as reliable as he had always believed, that the fundamental laws governing his universe were far more flexible and uncertain than he had ever imagined. "My heart is fine," he said, and even to his own ears the words carried a weight and complexity that had nothing to do with cardiovascular health and everything to do with the deeper questions of identity and belonging that were now swirling through his consciousness like storm clouds gathering on a previously clear horizon. That evening, as Elena prepared their dinner with the same methodical care and attention to detail that she had shown for decades, carefully seasoning the chicken, precisely timing the rice, ensuring that everything would be ready at exactly the same moment, so that their meal would be perfectly coordinated. Roberto found himself drawn to the hallway that connected their living areas, where family photographs lined the walls like sentries guarding the narrative of their shared life. These images, which he had passed thousands of times without really seeing them, now seemed to demand his attention with an urgency that was both compelling and uncomfortable. There was his father, Miguel Martinez, captured in a dozen different moments across the decades, standing proud beside his first truck when he started his own hauling business, holding Roberto as a toddler with hands that dwarfed the small child's body, teaching teenage Roberto how to change the oil in their family car with patient demonstrations and gentle corrections when his son's inexperienced hands fumbled with unfamiliar tools. Miguel had been a man of few words but strong convictions, someone who believed that actions spoke louder than speeches and that a man's character was best measured by his willingness to work hard and provide for his family regardless of the personal cost. He had worked double shifts at the steel mill for years, coming home exhausted and covered in the grime of honest labor, but always finding energy to help Roberto with homework or to listen to Elena's stories about her day or to fix whatever had broken around their modest home. Beside Miguel, in many of the photographs, was Carmen Martinez, Roberto's mother, whose laugh had been the soundtrack of his childhood, and whose gentle wisdom had guided him through the confusion and challenges of growing up in a world that often seemed too large and complicated for a young man to navigate alone. Carmen had possessed an intuitive understanding of people's emotions and needs, an ability to comfort with a touch or encourage with a smile that had made her beloved by everyone who knew her. But now, examining these familiar images with eyes that had been changed by Dr. Williams' revelations, Roberto began to notice details that had never registered before, subtle discrepancies that his subconscious mind might have registered, but his conscious awareness had never processed or questioned. His father's dark brown eyes, almost black in certain lighting, compared to Roberto's hazel green ones that shifted color depending on what he wore or the quality of light around him. His mother's delicate hands, fine-boned and elegant even when performing the roughest household tasks, compared to Roberto's broad, thick-fingered hands that seemed built for heavier work and grosser manipulation of tools and materials. The way he stood in every family photograph, a full 3 inches taller than either parent, a height difference they had always attributed to good nutrition and modern living, and the advantages your generation has that we never did. These details, which had never seemed significant during all the years when his identity was unquestioned and secure, now felt loaded with meaning and possibility, like clues to a mystery that had been hiding in plain sight for his entire life. "I think I might be adopted," Roberto said over dinner that evening, the words falling into their quiet dining room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the initial impact. Elena's fork, laden with the arroz con pollo that she had been perfecting since their early married days, and that had become one of the comfort foods that defined their shared domestic life, paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down with deliberate care, her movements becoming careful and measured in the way they always did when she was processing something significant, when her mind was working through implications and possibilities that required her full attention. "What makes you think that?" she asked, her voice maintaining its characteristic calm, but her eyes sharpening with the focused attention that Roberto had learned to recognize over the decades as a sign that Elena was shifting into a more serious mode of conversation, when casual chat gave way to the kind of deep discussion that could alter the course of their shared understanding. Roberto explained about the blood types, about Dr. Williams' gentle but unambiguous explanation of genetic impossibilities that had turned his world upside down in the span of a single medical consultation. As he talked, he watched Elena's face cycle through a series of expressions, surprise giving way to confusion, confusion melting into something that looked almost like recognition, and finally settling into what appeared to be a mixture of concern and something that puzzled him because it looked almost like relief. "You know," Elena said slowly when he had finished his explanation, her voice carrying the careful consideration of someone who was choosing her words with unusual precision, "there were always little things that made me wonder. Small details that didn't quite fit the family narrative but weren't significant enough to question directly." Roberto felt his heart skip, not from his medical condition, but from the sudden realization that the ground beneath his feet was even less solid than he had already discovered, that the foundations of his identity were more thoroughly undermined than even Dr. Williams's revelations had initially suggested. "What kind of things?" he asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer, afraid to discover that the signs of his different origins had been visible to others, even when they had been invisible to him. Elena reached across their small dining table and took his hand in both of hers, her thumbs tracing the familiar lines and calluses of his palm, as if she was reading a map she had memorized long ago, but was seeing with new understanding for the first time. "The way you never really looked like them," she said, her voice gentle but honest. "Not just individual features, but the deeper resemblance that children usually share with their parents. The genetic echoes that make family relationships obvious even to strangers. I always noticed that you didn't have that kind of clear physical connection to Miguel and Carmen, but I assumed it was just one of those genetic quirks that sometimes happen." She paused, clearly debating whether to continue, weighing the potential impact of revelations that she had apparently been carrying for years without sharing them. "And there were other things," she continued. "The way your mother would sometimes get this distant, almost melancholy look when you would ask questions about when you were a baby, about your early childhood, about family history. It was subtle, but I noticed it because I was studying her so carefully during those early years, when I was trying to understand the family I was marrying into." Roberto listened with growing amazement, realizing that Elena had been observing and cataloging details that had escaped his own notice, seeing patterns and connections that his emotional proximity to the situation had made invisible to him. "And then there was your father's funeral," Elena continued, her voice dropping slightly, as if she was sharing a confidence that she had kept locked away for years. "Do you remember that woman who came up to you afterward? The elderly lady with silver hair who kept staring at you like she was seeing a ghost, or trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering her for years?" Roberto did remember, though he had dismissed the encounter at the time as one of the many strange interactions that seem to happen at funerals, when grief and emotion make people behave in ways that don't always follow normal social conventions. "She asked if you were Miguel's son," Elena recalled, "and when you confirmed that you were, she got this expression on her face like she wanted to say something else, something important, but then she seemed to change her mind and just walked away without another word. I always wondered what she had been about to tell you." Sleep became an elusive companion for Roberto that night, and many nights that followed. He lay beside Elena in the bed they had shared for decades, listening to the familiar rhythm of her breathing while his own mind raced through possibilities and implications that seemed to multiply rather than resolve as he examined them from different angles. The digital clock on Elena's nightstand marked the slow passage of hours with red numbers that seemed to mock his inability to find rest, to find peace with the questions that Dr. Williams' revelation had unleashed in his consciousness. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself wondering about the woman who had given birth to him, about the circumstances that had led to his placement with Miguel and Carmen, about the family and heritage and genetic legacy that remained completely unknown to him. By morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through their bedroom curtains, Roberto had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying in its implications for the carefully ordered life he and Elena had built together. He would search for the truth about his origins, whatever that truth might be and wherever that search might lead him. The public library, which had always been Roberto's sanctuary during his working years, a place where he could escape the noise and chaos of construction sites and lose himself in books about woodworking techniques or home repair or the biographies of men who had built things that lasted, now became his research headquarters, the command center for an investigation into his own identity that would test his patience, his determination, and his emotional resilience in ways that 4 decades of physical labor had never challenged him. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the head librarian who had helped him locate repair manuals and home improvement guides for years, seemed to understand without being told that his current project was fundamentally different from his previous research needs. There was something in his manner, perhaps, or in the way he approached her reference desk with questions that were more personal and urgent than his usual requests for information about plumbing repairs or electrical work. Birth records and adoption files can be extremely challenging to navigate, she explained, with the gentle expertise of someone who had guided many other searchers through similar journeys of discovery, especially for adoptions that took place in the 1960s, when record-keeping was less standardized and when privacy laws were quite different from what we have today. Many agencies destroyed files after certain periods, and others sealed them permanently to protect all parties involved. Mrs. Patterson showed him how to access the library's digital archives, how to search through databases of birth announcements and obituaries, and marriage records that might contain clues about his biological family. She introduced him to genealogy websites and DNA testing services and support groups for adult adoptees who were attempting to reunite with their birth families. "The most important thing to remember," she told him as they sat together at one of the library's computer terminals, "is that this kind of search requires enormous patience and emotional stamina. You'll encounter dead ends and false leads and bureaucratic obstacles that can be incredibly frustrating. But many people do eventually find the answers they're looking for, and the resources available today are far better than what existed even 10 years ago." Roberto threw himself into the research with the same methodical determination that had made him successful in construction, treating each lead like a blueprint to be followed, each dead end like a structural problem to be solved through persistence and creative thinking. He filled notebook after notebook with names and dates and theories, creating elaborate timelines and family trees based on fragments of information that might or might not be relevant to his particular story. The work was painstaking and often heartbreaking. He spent hours scrolling through digitized records of babies born in October 1960, reading brief announcements in long-defunct newspapers about children whose birth parents couldn't be identified from the sparse information available in public records. He contacted adoption agencies that had closed decades ago, only to be told that their files had been destroyed or transferred to other organizations that had also subsequently closed or relocated. He learned about the complex web of Catholic charities and social service agencies that had managed adoptions in the early 1960s, about the cultural attitudes toward unwed mothers that had shaped the practices and policies of that era, about the legal frameworks that had prioritized secrecy and sealed records over the possibility of future reunification between birth parents and children. Some days the search felt hopeful, when a new lead would emerge or when a genealogy match would suggest a possible connection to explore. Other days it felt overwhelming and futile, when weeks of research would lead nowhere, or when bureaucratic obstacles would block access to information that might have been crucial to understanding his origins. Elena watched her husband transform during these months of searching, noting how the man who had always found satisfaction in concrete problems with clear solutions was struggling to adapt to a quest that seemed to resist his usual approaches to challenge and difficulty. She found him at his computer at all hours, following digital trails that often dissolved under closer examination, pursuing hunches that led to more questions rather than answers. "Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved," she suggested gently one evening after Roberto had spent another fruitless day chasing leads that had promised more than they delivered. But Roberto had become too invested in the search to consider abandoning it, too committed to the idea that somewhere in the maze of records and databases and archived documents was the key to understanding who he really was and where he had come from. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not through digital databases or genealogy websites or careful analysis of public records, but through the kind of chance encounter that seems to suggest that some things are meant to happen when the time is right, and the circumstances align in ways that can't be planned or predicted. It was a cold December morning when Roberto found himself once again at Restland Cemetery, standing before the modest granite headstone that marked the graves of Miguel and Carmen Martinez. He hadn't come to conduct research this time, hadn't brought his notebook or his theories, or his growing collection of genealogy charts and family trees based on speculation and hope, rather than documented fact. Instead, he had come simply to talk to the people who had raised him, to share his confusion and his guilt about questioning the story they had told him about his origins, to seek some kind of peace with the complicated feelings of love and betrayal and gratitude and resentment that had been swirling through his consciousness for months. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said aloud to the headstone, his breath visible in the cold air as he spoke to the memory of parents who could no longer respond to his questions or explain their choices, or help him understand the decisions they had made on his behalf, decades before he was old enough to have opinions about his own life. It was then that he became aware of another presence in the cemetery, someone approaching slowly from the direction of the newer section where the headstones were still bright and the grass was still thin over recently disturbed earth. Roberto looked up to see an elderly man walking with the careful gait of someone whose joints protested movement, but whose determination was stronger than physical discomfort. The man was tall and thin, with silver hair and a face that was deeply lined, but somehow familiar in a way that made Roberto's heart begin to beat faster, even before any words were exchanged between them. "Excuse me," the man said as he approached, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who was about to interrupt something private, but felt compelled to do so by circumstances beyond normal social conventions. "I hope you'll forgive me for intruding, but I couldn't help noticing you, and I have to ask, are you Roberto Martinez?" Roberto stood slowly, brushing cemetery dirt from his knees and studying the stranger's face with growing amazement. There was something in the man's eyes, in the shape of his nose, in the way he held his head, that triggered a recognition that preceded understanding. "Yes, I am," Roberto replied, his voice sounding strange to his own ears in the quiet of the cemetery. "Do we know each other?" The elderly man's face underwent a transformation that was subtle but profound, as if decades of hope and doubt and patient waiting were resolving themselves into certainty and joy. He smiled, and in that smile Roberto saw something that made his knees feel weak and his heart race with possibilities he hadn't dared to fully imagine. "My name is Frank Sullivan," the man said, and each word seemed to carry the weight of years of searching and wondering and never quite giving up hope. I'm certain, that you're my nephew. You're the absolute image of my sister Mary at your age, and I've been looking for you for more years than I care to count." Frank Sullivan's words hung in the cold December air like a bridge between Roberto's old understanding of himself and a new reality that was still taking shape in his consciousness. The cemetery, with its rows of headstones and bare winter trees, suddenly felt like the most significant place in the world, the location where his life would be divided into before and after this moment of revelation. "Your sister," Roberto managed to say, though his voice seemed to be coming from very far away, as if someone else was speaking while his real self remained frozen in amazement and disbelief. Frank nodded, his eyes bright with tears that he was making no effort to hide. "Mary Sullivan. She would have been 79 now if she had lived to see this day. She died 3 years ago, but she never stopped believing that someday she would find you again, or that you would find your way back to the family that never forgot about you." Frank reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet, from which he carefully extracted a small photograph that looked like it had been handled countless times over the years. He offered it to Roberto with hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion or both. The photograph showed a young woman who could have been Roberto's twin, someone who shared his eyes, his smile, his stubborn chin, and his way of tilting his head when concentrating on something serious. She was holding a baby who was unmistakably him, and the love in her expression was so clear and powerful that it took Roberto's breath away. "She named you Thomas," Frank said softly, as Roberto studied the photograph with wonder and growing understanding. "Thomas Michael Sullivan. But she always hoped that your adoptive family would give you a name that suited the man you would become, and she would have been so proud to know that you became Roberto Martinez, that you built a good life and found happiness even though she couldn't be part of it." Roberto felt tears beginning to flow down his cheeks as he absorbed this information, as he began to understand that he had been loved and missed, and searched for by people he had never known existed. "She tried to find you," Frank continued, his voice thick with emotion as he shared a story that he had apparently been waiting years to tell. When the laws began to change in the 1970s and 1980s, when it became more possible for birth parents and adopted children to reconnect, she hired private investigators and contacted agencies, and never stopped hoping that somehow the barriers that had separated you could be overcome. Frank explained that Mary Sullivan had worked as a nurse for 35 years, dedicating her professional life to caring for other people's children, while never forgetting the son she had been forced to give up. She had married a good man who understood about Roberto and supported her hope of someday being reunited with her first child. She had raised 3 other children who grew up knowing they had a brother somewhere in the world. "She left something for you," Frank said, reaching again into his coat pocket and withdrawing an envelope that looked like it had been waiting decades to fulfill its purpose. "She wrote this letter 2 years before she died, when she was sick and knew she might not live to see you again. But she wanted to make sure that if you ever found us, you would know how much you were loved." Roberto's hands shook as he took the envelope, which bore his name written in handwriting that he had never seen but that somehow felt familiar, as if his genetic memory retained some echo of the woman who had given him life. The paper was cream-colored and slightly yellowed with age, and it smelled faintly of the lavender sachets that some women of Mary Sullivan's generation had used to keep their personal belongings fresh and sweet. Frank stepped back respectfully, understanding that what was about to happen needed to be experienced in privacy, that some moments are too sacred and personal to be witnessed even by those who have facilitated them. Roberto opened the envelope with careful reverence, his construction-hardened hands surprisingly gentle, as he unfolded the pages of Mary Sullivan's final message to the son she had never stopped loving. The handwriting was careful and elegant, the writing of someone who had taken great care to choose exactly the right words for what might be her only opportunity to communicate with the child she had given away. "I became a nurse because I wanted to take care of children, even if they couldn't be you," Mary's letter continued. "Every child I cared for in 35 years of nursing carried a piece of my heart that belonged to you. My colleagues often commented that I had a special gift with children, but the truth was that I was practicing, learning how to be the mother I never got to be for you, hoping that somehow the love I gave to other people's children would find its way back to you wherever you were." She wrote about meeting and marrying James Sullivan, a gentleman who had known about Roberto from their first date, and had never once suggested that she should forget about her first child or stop hoping for reunion. She described how they had built a family together. Susan in 1963, Jennifer in 1965, Michael in 1967, and how she had told each of her children about their older brother who lived somewhere in the world. "Your siblings grew up knowing they had a brother," Mary explained. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every family celebration, we set an extra place at the table for you. It became our tradition, our way of keeping you present in our family, even though you couldn't be with us physically. The children would sometimes ask when you were coming home, and I would tell them that someday, when the time was right, our family would be complete again." The letter revealed decades of searching, private investigators hired in the 1970s, letters written to adoption agencies, requests filed with courts, DNA samples submitted to databases that might help connect separated family members. Mary had never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that love could overcome the legal and social barriers that kept families apart. "As I write this letter, I know that my time is growing short," the letter continued, Mary's handwriting becoming slightly less steady as she acknowledged her mortality. "The cancer has spread, and the doctors have told me things I don't want to hear. But I'm not afraid to die, Thomas Roberto, because I believe with all my heart that love is stronger than death, and that somehow, some way, you will find your way back to the family that has never stopped loving you. I hope the people who raised you were everything I prayed they would be, kind and patient and wise, giving you the childhood I couldn't provide, teaching you to be the good man I always knew you would become. I hope they loved you so completely that you never felt the absence of the mother who had to let you go. And I hope that if you do find us someday, there might be room in your heart for both the family who raised you and the family who gave you life. Please know that you were conceived in love, born in love, and given away in love. Every decision I made was based on what I believed would be best for you, even when it broke my heart. You have 3 siblings who have spent their entire lives hoping to meet you, an uncle who has never stopped searching for you, and a mother who will love you until her last breath and beyond." The letter was signed simply, "Your loving mother, Mary Sullivan," followed by a postscript that brought fresh tears to Roberto's eyes. "P.S. I've enclosed a St. Christopher medal that belonged to your father. He was wearing it when he died, and the army sent it back to his parents, who gave it to me when they learned about you. May it protect you on all your journeys, especially the one that brings you home to us." Frank Sullivan waited patiently while Roberto absorbed the contents of his birth mother's letter, understanding that some experiences cannot be rushed or shared, that some moments require the full attention and emotional capacity of the person living through them. When Roberto finally looked up from the pages, his eyes red with tears, but his expression transformed by a kind of wonder and completion he had never experienced before. Frank smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had finally fulfilled a sacred promise. "She talked about you constantly," Frank said as they walked slowly through the cemetery together. Two men who had been strangers an hour earlier, but who were now connected by bonds of family and shared purpose. Every family gathering, every holiday, every quiet evening when she would get that distant look in her eyes, we all knew she was thinking about you, wondering where you were, whether you were happy, whether you remembered being loved before you could even form memories. Frank explained that he had been 15 years old when Mary became pregnant, old enough to understand the family crisis, but too young to have any influence over the decisions that were made. He had watched his sister disappear for months during her pregnancy, sent away to a home for unwed mothers where she could hide her condition from the neighbors and the community that would have judged her harshly for her situation. When she came back without you, she was different, Frank recalled, his voice heavy with decades of witnessed pain. She tried to act like nothing had happened, like she could just go back to being a normal teenager. But anyone who knew her could see that part of her heart was missing. She would stare at other people's babies for hours, and whenever she saw a little boy who was about the age you would have been, she would get this hopeful, heartbroken expression that just about killed all of us who loved her. Frank told Roberto about Mary's marriage to James Sullivan, a man who had fallen in love with her despite, or perhaps because of, the sadness she carried for her lost child. James had understood that Mary came with a love that could not be given entirely to him. That part of her heart would always belong to a son she couldn't raise, and he had not only accepted this, but had helped her maintain hope for eventual reunion. He was the one who suggested we hire the first private investigator, Frank revealed. This was in 1975, when you would have been about 15 years old. The laws were starting to change a little bit, and there were organizations forming to help connect birth parents with children who had been placed for adoption. We spent our savings, money we had been planning to use for a new car, but it didn't matter to any of us if it meant finding you. The investigation had led nowhere, blocked by sealed records and agencies that had closed or destroyed their files. But James and Mary had not given up. They had tried again in the 1980s and again in the 1990s, each time hoping that changes in technology or attitudes or legal frameworks might finally provide the breakthrough they needed. When the internet became available, Mary learned how to use it specifically to search for you, Frank continued. This was a woman who had never shown any interest in technology, but she taught herself to navigate genealogy websites and adoption reunion databases because she thought it might help her find her son. She joined every support group, contacted every agency, submitted her DNA to every service that might connect her with you. Frank pulled out his phone and showed Roberto photographs of Mary throughout the decades. Mary as a young nurse in her crisp white uniform, Mary on her wedding day with James beaming beside her, Mary with her 3 children who had grown up knowing they had an older brother somewhere in the world. Susan, Jennifer, and Michael always knew about you, Frank explained. Mary never tried to hide the fact that they had an older brother who couldn't be with the family. They grew up with your absence as a constant presence in our lives, if that makes sense. They knew your birthday, they knew the story of how you came to be, and they never stopped believing that someday you would find your way back to us. The phone call that Frank made from the cemetery that cold December morning set in motion a reunion that had been 63 years in the making. Within hours, Roberto's phone was ringing with calls from siblings he had never known existed, voices carrying decades of hope and excitement, and barely contained joy at the news that their long-lost brother had finally been found. Susan Sullivan Martinez, who had, by coincidence, married into a family with the same surname that Roberto carried, was the first to call. At 58 years old, she was a retired elementary school teacher whose voice carried the same gentle warmth that Roberto remembered from his adoptive mother, but with an underlying excitement that was entirely her own. "Roberto? Thomas? I don't even know what to call you," she said through tears that Roberto could hear in her voice even over the phone. "I've been waiting my entire life for this conversation. We all have. Mom always said that someday we would be a complete family. And now, oh God, I can't believe this is really happening." Jennifer Sullivan Chen, 56 years old and an artist living in the Pacific Northwest, called next. Her voice was deeper than Susan's, more cautious, as if she was afraid that too much enthusiasm might somehow jinx the moment they had all been hoping for since childhood. "I want you to know that I've been painting you for years," she told Roberto, in a confession that was both strange and deeply moving. "I know that sounds crazy, but I've been having dreams about a brother I've never met, and I've been putting those dreams on canvas. I have a whole series of paintings that I call Letters to My Missing Brother. And now I can't wait to show them to you and see if my artist's imagination got anything right about what you actually look like." Michael Sullivan, the youngest at 54 and a physical therapist who had inherited Mary's healing touch, was the most emotional of the three when he called. Roberto could hear him struggling to maintain composure as he spoke about growing up as the only boy in a family that had always felt incomplete without the older brother who was supposed to be there. "You have to understand," Michael said, "that every major event in our lives has been marked by your absence. Every birthday party where we wondered if you were having a good day, too. Every Christmas morning when we looked at the empty chair we always set for you and hoped that somehow you were opening presents with a family who loved you. Every graduation, every wedding, every time one of us had children and realized that you were becoming an uncle without ever knowing it." The emotional weight of these conversations was almost overwhelming for Roberto, who had lived his entire life as an only child, and was now discovering that he had siblings who had been thinking about him and missing him and building their identities partially around his absence for 6 decades. Elena watched her husband navigate these calls with a mixture of wonder and concern, understanding that she was witnessing a transformation that would fundamentally alter the man she had married. The Roberto who had awakened that morning was different from the Roberto who was now making plans to meet siblings he had never known existed. "Are you ready for this?" she asked him that evening, as they sat together in their living room, surrounded by the familiar comforts of the life they had built together, but aware that everything was about to change in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," Roberto replied honestly, "but I've spent months wondering who I really am, where I came from, whether there were people out there who might be wondering about me the way I've been wondering about them. And now I know. Now I have answers that I never expected to find, and I have to follow this wherever it leads." 3 days later, Roberto found himself standing outside a suburban home in a neighborhood he had driven through countless times, without ever imagining that it contained pieces of his genetic heritage and family history. Elena squeezed his hand as they approached the front door, her earlier concerns about the search having transformed into the kind of loving support that had sustained their marriage through decades of smaller challenges and adjustments. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman who looked like a feminine version of Roberto's own face, someone who shared his eyes and his smile and his way of holding her head when she was experiencing strong emotions. "Roberto," Susan said, though his name came out more as a sob than a word. "Oh my God, you look exactly like Mom did when she was your age. You look exactly like the son she described to us 1,000 times but never got to see grow up." What followed was an embrace that seemed to collapse 63 years of separation into a single moment of connection and recognition. Roberto found himself holding a sister he had never known he had, crying tears that seemed to come from a place deeper than conscious emotion, from some genetic memory of belonging that had been dormant his entire life, but was now awakening with overwhelming force. Jennifer and Michael arrived within minutes of each other, both carrying photo albums and artwork and decades of accumulated memories about the brother they had never stopped hoping to meet. The family resemblance was unmistakable and profound. Not just individual features, but the deeper genetic signatures that mark people as members of the same tribe, the same bloodline, the same story. "This is so surreal," Jennifer said as they gathered in Susan's living room, studying each other's faces and gestures and mannerisms with the fascination of people discovering that they were not unique in the world, that there were others who shared their genetic blueprint and family characteristics. I mean, I've been imagining this moment since I was 5 years old, but the reality of it is so much more intense than I ever expected. Michael, as the family's designated keeper of memories and documentation, had brought boxes of photographs and documents that told the story of the Sullivan family across the decades. He spread them across Susan's coffee table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that was finally finding its complete picture. "These are all the places where you should have been," he explained as he showed Roberto image after image of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, milestone moments, and ordinary days that had been marked by the absence of their older brother. "Every one of these photos has an empty space where you were supposed to be standing, sitting, laughing with us." Manuel, but the most powerful moment came when Susan brought out a small wooden box that had been waiting 63 years to fulfill its purpose. Inside was the St. Christopher medal that Mary Sullivan had mentioned in her letter, the piece of jewelry that had belonged to Roberto's biological father, and had been intended as his inheritance from a man he would never have the chance to meet. "She always said that when we found you, this would be the proof that you were really her son," Susan explained, as she placed the medal in Roberto's hands. "She said that love finds a way to bridge any distance, overcome any obstacle, and bring families back together when the time is right." Amoanige, Roberto held the medal, feeling its weight and warmth, understanding that he was touching something that had belonged to his biological father, something that connected him not just to Mary Sullivan, but to a man named Michael O'Brien, who had died in Vietnam before learning that he was going to be a father. As the weeks and months passed following his reunion with the Sullivan family, Roberto discovered that finding his biological relatives had not diminished his love and respect for Miguel and Carmen Martinez, but had instead expanded his understanding of the different forms that family love could take and the various ways that people could belong to each other. Miguel and Carmen had chosen him deliberately and consciously, making the decision to build their family through adoption with the kind of intentional commitment that biological parents don't necessarily have to make. They had given him their name, their values, their work ethic, and their unshakable belief that family was something you built through daily choices and consistent love, rather than something you inherited through genetic accident. But Mary Sullivan had given him life itself, and then had made the ultimate sacrifice of letting him go so that he could have opportunities and advantages that she, as a teenage single mother in 1960, could never have provided. She had spent the rest of her life proving that a mother's love doesn't require proximity to persist, that the bonds between parent and child can survive decades of separation and uncertainty. The Sullivan siblings, meanwhile, had given him something he had never known he was missing: the experience of belonging to people who shared his genetic heritage, who understood him on levels that had nothing to do with learned behavior or cultural adaptation and everything to do with the mysterious connections that tie people together through blood and DNA. Roberto found himself scheduling regular visits with his newfound family, while maintaining his established relationships with Elena's relatives and the friends who had become like family during his decades in the community. His social calendar, which had been relatively simple during his retirement years, suddenly became complex with birthday parties and holiday gatherings and casual dinners with people who were simultaneously strangers and intimately familiar. Elena adapted to these changes with the grace and flexibility that had characterized her approach to marriage and family throughout their relationship. She embraced Roberto's siblings as if they were her own newfound relatives, involving herself in their lives and making space in their home for the photographs and mementos that Roberto was accumulating as he learned about his biological family's history and traditions. "It's like we suddenly have a bigger family," she observed one evening as they prepared to attend Jennifer's art show, where several of her letters to my missing brother paintings would be displayed publicly for the first time. "I always wondered what it would be like to have sisters-in-law and a brother-in-law, and now I get to find out." The integration of Roberto's two family histories created some unexpected discoveries and coincidences. Susan's husband turned out to have worked construction in the same areas where Roberto had built some of his most significant projects, though they had never crossed paths professionally. Michael's physical therapy practice was located just 3 miles from the house Roberto and Elena had shared for over 20 years. Jennifer's art had been displayed in galleries that Roberto had walked past countless times without knowing that the artist was his biological sister. "It's like we've been living parallel lives," Michael observed during one of their family dinners. "Moving in the same general area, working in related fields, even shopping in some of the same stores and restaurants, but never quite connecting until the universe decided it was time for us to find each other." Roberto began to understand that his lifelong sense of not quite fitting in, of being somehow different from his adoptive family in ways that had nothing to do with love or acceptance, had been the result of genetic and temperamental differences that were now explained by his connection to the Sullivan family. His artistic inclinations, which had never made complete sense in the context of Miguel's practical, no-nonsense approach to life, were clearly inherited from Jennifer's side of the family. His instinct for healing and helping others, which had manifested in his willingness to mentor younger workers and his volunteer activities in retirement, were obviously connected to Mary's career in nursing and Michael's work in physical therapy. 2 years after that life-changing blood test, Roberto Martinez had achieved something he had never expected when he first began searching for answers about his origins: a complete sense of peace with the complexity of his identity and heritage. He had learned to hold space for all the different aspects of who he was, understanding that identity was not a single truth to be discovered, but a collection of truths that could coexist and complement each other. He was simultaneously the son of Miguel and Carmen Martinez, who had raised him with love and dedication and given him the foundation for a successful and meaningful life, and the son of Mary Sullivan and Michael O'Brien, who had given him life and genetic heritage, and a biological family that had never stopped loving him despite decades of separation. The workshop behind his house, which had always been Roberto's sanctuary and creative space, had become something even more meaningful during these years of family integration and personal growth. He had begun creating memory boxes for other adult adoptees who had successfully reunited with their biological families. Intricate wooden containers designed to hold the letters, photographs, documents, and mementos that marked these profound journeys of discovery and connection. Each box was unique, reflecting the specific story of reunion it would commemorate, carved with symbols and decorated with details that captured the essence of individual family stories. Roberto found deep satisfaction in this work, understanding that he was helping other people honor and preserve the same kind of miraculous reconnections that had transformed his own understanding of identity and belonging. Elena often found him in the workshop during the evenings, working with the same steady concentration he had always brought to his projects, but with a new sense of purpose that hadn't been there during his earlier retirement years. The man who had spent his career building structures for other people had finally learned how to build a complete foundation for his own life and identity. "You seem different," she observed one evening as she brought him coffee while he put finishing touches on a memory box designed for a woman who had found her birth mother after 40 years of searching. "More settled somehow, more complete." Roberto considered her observation as he continued his careful sanding of the box's interior surfaces, understanding what she meant and recognizing the truth of her perception. "I think I spent my whole life feeling like there was something missing," he replied, "but I never knew what it was or how to find it. I just had this sense that I wasn't quite complete, that there were pieces of myself that I couldn't access or understand. And now..." He paused in his work and looked up at Elena, this woman who had loved him through decades of marriage and supported him through the challenging journey of discovering his full identity. "Now I know that I was already exactly who I was supposed to be," he continued. "I just needed to understand the whole story to appreciate all the different elements that came together to create the person I became. Miguel and Carmen gave me security and values, and the foundation for building a good life. Mary and Michael gave me life itself and genetic traits that explain things about myself that never made sense before. The Sullivan family gave me a sense of genetic belonging that I didn't even know I was missing. And you've given me the love and support that made it possible to integrate all of these different pieces into a coherent whole." Roberto had also legally changed his middle name to Thomas, honoring the name that Mary Sullivan had given him while keeping Roberto as his primary identity, reflecting the man he had become through the love and guidance of his adoptive family. His full name was now Roberto Thomas Martinez, a combination that acknowledged both his origins and his upbringing, both the family that had given him life and the family that had raised him to adulthood. At family gatherings that now included both Martinez relatives and Sullivan relatives, Roberto was often struck by the miraculous nature of the journey that had brought them all together. The blood test that had started his search for truth now seemed less like a medical accident and more like destiny revealing itself according to its own mysterious timeline. During quiet moments, Roberto sometimes reflected on the woman at Miguel's funeral, who had stared at him with recognition and seemed to want to tell him something important before walking away without speaking. He wondered if she had been connected to Mary Sullivan's family, if she had recognized genetic traits that he had been carrying unknowingly his entire life, if his reunion with his biological family might have happened years earlier, if he had been brave enough to pursue that strange encounter. But he had learned to be grateful for the timing of his discovery, rather than regretful about its delay. At 63, he had been mature enough to handle the emotional complexity of dual family loyalties, established enough in his own life to reach out to biological relatives without losing his sense of self, and wise enough to understand that finding his birth family was not a rejection of his adoptive family, but an expansion of his capacity for love and connection. The envelope that had trembled in his hands that Tuesday morning at St. Mary's Hospital had contained more than blood test results that challenged his understanding of his genetic heritage. It had contained the key to discovering that identity was not a single, simple truth to be uncovered, but a beautiful and complex tapestry, woven from multiple sources of love, influence, and connection. Roberto Martinez had lived 63 years believing he knew exactly who he was, and the blood test had revealed that his identity was actually far more rich and multifaceted than he had ever imagined. He had been blessed not with one family, but with two families who had loved him in different ways and for different reasons, each contributing essential elements to the man he had become. And sometimes, he had learned, the most beautiful discovery is not finding out that you were someone different than you thought you were, but finding out that you were exactly who you were meant to be, shaped by more love, more sacrifice, more hope, and more determination than you had ever dared to imagine possible. In the end, Roberto Thomas Martinez understood that family is not defined by genetics alone, or by legal adoption alone, but by the mysterious alchemy of love, commitment, sacrifice, and hope that transforms strangers into relatives and creates bonds that can survive decades of separation and uncertainty. Some truths are worth waiting 63 years to discover, and some journeys are worth taking, even when you don't know where they will lead, because the destination is always less important than the love you find along the way. My dearest Thomas Roberto. The letter began, "If you are reading these words, then God has finally answered the prayer I have said every single day for more than 50 years. I don't know if you will ever be able to forgive me for giving you away, but I hope with all my heart that you will understand I was only 17 years old, unmarried, and absolutely convinced that I could never provide you with the life you deserve to have." Roberto read slowly, absorbing every word as Mary Sullivan's voice seemed to speak to him across the years, bridging the gap between the life he had lived and the life that might have been. "Your father was a young man named Michael O'Brien," the letter continued, "and he was the kindest, most gentle soul I had ever met. We were planning to be married when he finished his military service, but he was killed in Vietnam 2 months before you were born. He never knew about you, but I like to think that somewhere he knows now, and that he would be as proud of the man you became as I have always been, even though I could only love you from a distance." Mary Sullivan wrote about the shame and pressure she had faced from her family and her community, about the home for unwed mothers, where she had spent the final months of her pregnancy learning to believe that her love for her unborn child was selfish if it prevented her from giving him to a proper family who could provide opportunities she never could. "I held you for exactly 37 minutes after you were born," she wrote. "I counted every second because I knew they would be the only moments I would ever have with you, and I wanted to remember everything. The way your tiny fingers curled around mine, the sound of your breathing, the perfect weight of you in my arms. The social worker promised me that you would go to a good Catholic family who desperately wanted a child, and I signed the papers because I believed it was the most loving thing I could do for you." The letter revealed that Mary had tried to reclaim him within 6 months of the adoption, when she had found work and convinced herself she could manage as a single mother. But the legal process had already been completed and could not be reversed. I want you to know that not a single day passed without me thinking of you, wondering if you were happy, if you were healthy, if the family who adopted you was giving you all the love and opportunities I had dreamed of providing but knew I couldn't. I told myself that as long as you were loved and cared for, my sacrifice had meaning and purpose. But oh, how my heart ached to know for certain that you were all right. Roberto found himself crying openly as he read about Mary Sullivan's decades of wondering and hoping, about the way she had built a life around the empty space where her first child should have been.